Takshashila's 2025 China Challenge Survey is your opportunity to have a say in how India approaches China today and in the years to come. So zoom out, weigh in, and make your voice heard. Take the survey today. Link in description.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Shreya, your host for today, and I'm joined by my colleague, Anwesha. Hi, Anwesha.
Hi, Shreya. Thank you for having me.
So me and Anwesha happen to be reading the same book called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, where she makes a case for how our world is built on a gender data gap. And both of us are acutely aware of this problem. And so are many other women who are viscerally, consciously, and acutely aware of how there is a strong data gender gap. And in this book, Perez makes a case for how systems are designed around the male body and male usage patterns, while women's data is largely unexamined. And she cites examples across geographies and across fields to make her point, from urban planning, transport, health, consumer products, technology, disaster response, and economics. The book includes examples of systems designed on the assumption that the male body and the male experience are default modes. And so this leaves a huge gap, and women's data, how they travel, how they work, how they get sick, how they recover, how they use public spaces is missing. And so with this invisible data, the question is also that the world we build does not work very well for them. And this calls into question important issues on, subpar policy making, solutioning, which is a result of bad reporting, information that's not available, that's not examined. And at the end, this is a sizable economic cost. So we decided we'd talk about the ideas in this book and some possibilities for how India as a country with a sizable population of women who are in the workforce and otherwise to pivot accordingly. So Anwesha, what was your first impression from the book? What stood out?
So Shreya, I think a lot of the second and third order effects that she mentions in the book resulting from this data gap is something that really stood out and, weren't particularly things that we might have thought of. So for example, she gives couple of examples of where during post-disaster reconstruction, say after a hurricane or an earthquake, the post-conflict or disaster planning boards were overwhelmingly male, and as a result even led to homes being rebuilt without kitchens, without, and this is an Indian example where homes were built without spaces for animals. I think this is after the Bhuj earthquake in 2001. Even if we look towards the west, after a couple of hurricanes in the US, when they were, allocating resources for rebuilding facilities, there was a prioritization of rebuilding business centers over perhaps childcare facilities and healthcare facilities, etc. Additionally, a lot of the safety infrastructure that's built in order to protect society from cyclones and conflicts, those are often also built without female input, and as a result it leads to environments that expose women to sexual harassment and violence. And so a lot of this sort of not just data gap but also the lack of women's inputs being taken as part of these sort of policy making or strategizing for these sort of issues eventually have some sort of a direct connection to increased sexual harassment and violence in many different spaces. This is one example, but even in our day-to-day lives, the way that perhaps transport facilities are planned, or perhaps how washroom facilities are planned, sanitary requirements, etc. Those inadvertently affect women a lot more. and often result in increased sexual harassment.
Yes. Just speaking from one of the points you mentioned, right? The author brings up this example of the Barbican Art Center in London, where there's this very well intentioned decision of giving a 50-50 space allotment to both male and female um, washrooms was decided. So a certain amount of space would be divided in half for male and female washrooms. And they also put up signs saying gender neutral. That way, the capacity is also double. There was gender neutral with urinals and gender neutral with cubicles. But the fact that one set of washrooms had only urinals meant that only men could access those and use those, whereas the other washroom with which were gender neutral plus had cubicles could be accessed by women and men. So this led to women having longer queues to access that one set of cubicles that didn't have urinals but were for both genders, whereas the gender neutral washrooms with urinals only men could access. So this is a classic example of how design is done in a way that is gender neutral on the face of it. Space is allocated in an equal and fair manner, but it's still not resulting in equitable results for women in this case, because they have lesser cubicles to access, which leads to more wait time and overall a poor experience for them. This was one of the examples that was cited. There are other examples across public facilities, like leisure facilities, public gyms, public parks. We see a lot of these in India as well, right? You'll find a lot of public parks in India predominantly accessed by men, and the natural continuation of that thought is, oh, women don't go out more, or they don't exercise more, they don't spend much time living a full life. But often these are sort of heuristics we jump to without checking to see if these public spaces have been designed for women. In a lot of research that's coming up, it's found that women prefer well lit, clean, safe public spaces, but those aren't the same sort of requirements that men veer to. You'll find that in terms of safety as well, women prefer having security personnel around them more than sort of technological solutions like a camera or access to some sort of tech related surveillance system. Whereas men find the presence of a camera or another surveillance system welcome and sort of preferable. This is not the same experience that women face. They do prefer to have like a conductor or someone sort of overseeing in person. So the book goes into detail about how men and women have very different, often requirements of what qualifies safety, health, what makes sense to them. A lot of public recreation centers designed with one universal gender in mind, mostly in this case men, don't see a lot of women coming and playing tennis or badminton. Um, and so, in some cities, when researchers have gone on to see why this is the case, why there's so much attrition, women don't participate, they've then gone on to make separate tennis courts or badminton courts specifically for women, cordon off that section to see more participation from them. And so, there's a bunch of decisions that come from going down this road that you won't otherwise see in a default male format execution. There's also so many other smaller ways where this shows, right? A lot of our consumer products are designed with the male default. Like the book talks about how pianos and phones are designed for the average male hand, which is significantly bigger than the average, on average, than women's hands. And so there was this instance of a journalist who was in a crisis situation. There was a strike happening, and she had to take a video with one hand, but she wasn't able to because that phone just wasn't functional in her hand. And so there are so many such situations that go unrecorded, um, only because this is not information we're tracking. This is not something we know at scale. We only know of them as one-off instances. It's not something that we're actively solving for. So all of this was really interesting to see that this is also not something specific to India or
Right.
specific societies. It's
Right.
something that we see across economies, across societies, across geographies. There is clearly a strong lack of data on how women function. And I also want to clarify that more than women's needs, that sounds sort of untangible. It's also how women show up in a space
Mhm.
is markedly different. And so, as a consumer group or as a citizen group, there will need to be more reporting on this front. And it's also a chicken and egg situation where until you see more reporting, that's not data that can be acted upon. And until you act upon data, you're not going to try and capture more data. So this seems to be like a recurring issue. And it's only when some researchers or practitioners who curious enough to find out are invested enough also in most cases that of bringing up a solution and then seeing why isn't this working. It's only in those one-off cases that they end up getting to the root of the thing, that this is not a solution that women prefer at all, and so we'll have to go back to the drawing room and drawing board, sorry, and come up with a solution that does work for them.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think also to highlight that you mentioned that there's a lack of reporting of such data. There's also very significantly, especially in like medical research and healthcare, there's a exclusion of women or female rats or mice, etc., from clinical trials, and due to and to cite inconvenient research vessels due to fluctuating hormones or difficulties in recruiting women for such trials, etc. And so as a result, we know that women face, in addition to what would be termed normal diseases, which are specific, which also impact men, such as heart attacks, etc. They also have menstrual related issues which aren't as well researched as, say, other diseases. And also the impact of different health situations such as heart attacks are pretty much exclusively researched upon based on male data. So how it impacts a man's body is different from how it would impact a woman's body, but due to this sort of exclusion and also, like, the lack of reporting as well, a lot of the treatments, the medicines, the ways in which doctors and medical staff treat each of these issues is different based on whether the patient is a man or a woman. And while this is in some sense a data problem, there are obviously also societal problems and certain stereotypes where, for instance, it is thought that women may be hysterical, and that term itself is derived from bias against women, where it's thought that women overplay the amount of pain that they're feeling, or their pain isn't taken as seriously, and as a result is either dismissed or attributed to anxiety or other psychological issues. And this bias has sort of pervaded through our medical ecosystem, regardless of which country, regardless of what sort of socioeconomic area this sort of happens in. And as a result, this can have like pretty life threatening problems for women. Some of these instances, some of these diseases, which are also just specific to women, can be fatal if not treated at the right time. And so I think a common example, which I mean, for a lot of us is also anecdata, but now is being reported upon more and more as more women are entering the workforce, entering the research space, is that endometriosis is often diagnosed very late. It takes about, I think on average a decade to diagnose endometriosis. And it's also something that doesn't quite have a cure, has resulted in women going through multiple surgeries and years of pain, and chronic pain, that too. And so as a result, it not just hampers their access to life as it is, jobs, education, quality education, the way in which they're able to put the same amount of either effort into studying or working or just day to day life. So as a result, a lot of this exclusion from research has very, very significant impacts on a large section of even the female society.
Yeah, I mean, health products, even, right? Innovation in health
Right.
and wellness for women is also so under. Even the market hasn't come up with any solutions. Like VCs don't fund such projects, even. I mean, of course, this is much lighter than the points you mentioned, in that
Right.
those are life threatening. They put your life on hold, right? Imagine having like endometriosis sort of detected so late, and then that's a bulk of your adult life that you then have to manage, all because this research doesn't exist or hasn't been prioritized. While a bunch of other research, ideally everything should get prioritized, like all threatening illnesses should get equal priority. So it's not like we're canvassing for this over that, but that this should also be given equal priority. And so there is a lot of like you said, bias, right? Like there is people call into question hormones, emotions. It's not I personally think doctors are some of the most condescending group of people to women sometimes. Like even simple questions are responded. I don't know if it's like I'm sure it's anecdotal, but I'm sure a lot of women also face this, in that if you ask a question, you're not really responded to in like a practical, factual basis. There's a lot of sort of unsaid messaging that comes through, like you're worrying too much, or this is you're being irrational, that sort of thing. And of course, this is nothing that these female patients are going to be able to act upon or even call that doctor out on, because this is care that we also need. But I was also, like I was talking about earlier, there's a huge shortfall in market related solutions to health. But the markets are actually a great way to collect some of these data sets that can then be part of larger state programs if required, because that can function on its own. It's a self sustaining loop, but that's also not been the case, which is also a little bit disheartening, in that women are like one half the population, right? So this is obviously a lucrative market that we've clearly not capitalized on. Yeah. There was also this really interesting example from India from the book. While it cites examples from across the world, this one example from many years back on how Indian researchers came up with this low cost stove for Indian women as a replacement to the traditional chula, as they say, the mud and brick stove, because that was harmful, extremely polluting, causes respiratory illnesses for women who spend a lot of time on that. There were multiple prototypes and iterations, mostly by the government programs, on bringing an option to women that was efficient, was a more less harmful fuel than what they were currently using. But none of those seem to work, only because, and before I get into why they didn't work, the reason that was cited for many, many decades was that women are conservative, they're unwilling to change. They have something that works and they just want to keep doing that. They don't want to look to broader examples and solutions, which is something we hear to this day in a lot of different examples. But all of the solutions that were being presented to these women as replacements either needed more cooking time, so spend more time cooking, so meals take longer to make, or they needed some amount of repair or maintenance that the husband needed to do or the male partner needed to do. And this was assumed in the prototyping. Like, that's really cute, right? Like, so many years ago, to expect that just because there is a man in the house, he will help in maintaining this gadget, when even to this day men are not equal participants in domestic labor, right? At a household level. And so it took multiple iterations and researchers having to go back and find out. So this involves a lot of surveys, a lot of conversation. It's a very collaborative experience that not a lot of research projects have the time or the bandwidth to really get into. And so that's when they found out that these are not working for XYZ reasons. And then a stove called the Mewar Angiti stove came, that has been successful for many years since, but only after consultation with the users, so with
Right.
women who cook. And that's how a successful product was brought into market. And I think that's also why a lot of these, I wonder actually from reading the book, that if, um, I don't know if it's fair to say, but I wonder if women need to also be more actively involved in bringing solutions that they want to see, because the market's obviously not going to jump in places where there is no data.
Right.
And unfortunately and unfairly, the onus is again on a few women who can go that extra length, and
Yeah. Yeah.
capitalize on these ideas.
Yeah, no, I agree, and but I think over the past few decades, as we've seen more and more women enter the workforce, entering research, I think whatever a certain individual, say a scientist or whoever, innovates upon is also linked to perhaps their own personal experiences and the urge to solve a problem that they may be facing in their own lives. And so we've seen a lot more women researching these different areas on how to improve lives for women and improve these sort of technologies. So for instance, now we have AI become a big part of our day-to-day lives, and with that, even in the Indian context, we've seen a lot of startups, a lot of tools, and chatbots coming in, which are AI powered. And in the health space, at least, not just the health space, I think across the board, but particularly in health, we've seen women scientists, engineers getting together and developing, apps for which are specifically to help women deal with menstrual issues or pregnancy related issues, providing some form of guidance or connecting them to, telemedicine, where you have like an easier pipeline to get to a doctor, or just access to healthcare. So there's definitely a lot more awareness around these things. There's also been startups that focus on detecting breast cancer, and those sort of, quite gender specific issues. And so as a result, I think with more information, with even things like social media, there's a lot more awareness around these issues and how this impacts women. And with that comes more ideas for innovation, and clearly, as you mentioned, there is a market for this. So I think we are on a positive path to having better policies, technologies for women, and more sort of equitable regardless of gender. But also, with this positivity, there are certain use cases which may not have been researched well enough or deployed well enough, or even in some cases there are tech solutions which are just not suited for the problem they're trying to solve. So one example there, and this is also particularly in India's case, we have had mass surveillance solutions being put forth for women's safety. And this also sort of draws upon the idea that the author puts forth, where men tend to deploy tech solutions to societal problems, whereas, like you mentioned, women prefer having a, so to speak, human in the loop, or like having a security person in public spaces and those sort of things. But when we're talking about women's safety and gender-based violence, a lot of that violence occurs within a person's home. It's a lot of the times it's a family member who is the sort of predator in these cases. And so in those cases, mass surveillance doesn't really help. And just to like highlight why, I mean, the argument can be made that okay, there are other solutions for domestic gender based violence, but the thing is that mass surveillance systems cost a lot of money. There are third parties involved, you need a lot of CCTV cameras, and you need to have AI enabled cameras, which again adds to the cost. You need to have separate sort of headquarters or centers where this can be monitored, and you need more state capacity, more money being invested into this. And as a result, what is happening is a lot of money is being taken away from grassroots initiatives such as women's shelters and clinics, which would, in I mean, outside of a tier 1 city, these are places where women would go. And even within tier 1 cities, women would prefer to get that sort of help rather than relying upon a camera to firstly correctly detect that they are being attacked or they are facing sexual harassment, and then have a police person come and sort of rectify the situation. And so as a result, a lot of the money is sort of being invested in mass surveillance systems, which largely would not even work in a tier 2, tier 3 city or rural areas. And even within tier 1 cities, its accuracy is limited. You need to have really good quality cameras, and it also depends upon this sort of idea of emotion recognition. So the idea is that this sort of mass surveillance will help prevent crimes, and will be able to detect when a crime is about to happen. Now that in itself is quite problematic. I mean, how can one detect or prevent a crime before it's even happened? And so as a result, it looks for certain facial features, or whether a person looks scared, or one example is of, if a man is sort of walking with a glass bottle in their hand and is holding the bottle by the neck, there's high chance that that would be detected as the man holding an acid bottle, and so it's sort of predicting an acid attack, which
And this is in
clearly
real time.
this is in real time. So which clearly may not be the case. I mean, the possibility of a false positive is very high, as is the possibility of a false negative. And so these systems are really not quite there in terms of accuracy. And like I mentioned, since it costs a lot of money, the focus of those who are implementing these solutions then goes away from having solutions that have worked and will work, and require a more human touch to it. You need doctors, you need shelters on the ground, you need spaces where women can sort of escape and live for a bit without the fear of their predator coming after them. Provide support in those ways, healthcare, and yeah, so bunch of these things. And so we need to think about the ways in which we're deploying tech for women, like female issues or women's safety, those sort of things. And I think, yeah, there's always the you need to put more thought into what use cases are uh, would work, rather than just deploying tech for each and every sort of societal problem.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to you talk about this, right? There seems to be like a huge nuance issue here. It's
Yeah.
it's such a like sort of a blunt project,
Yeah.
and it's like so intensive in terms of cost, and also not meeting safety requirements. I doubt a woman on the street is going to feel any amount of safety knowing that this sort of a
Mm.
apparatus is in place. Yeah, I mean, just some amount of thoughtfulness. I feel like I don't think it's a lack of thoughtfulness. Like just reading the book, I didn't get a sense that we are a malicious group of people,
Yeah.
or who are sort of refraining from looking at women's data patterns. It's just something that we're extremely biased towards. I think women included, sometimes we sort of round off to the standard male example.
Yeah.
And this seems to be a lot of unlearning, a lot of call for nuance and thoughtful um, design, even,
Mm-hmm.
that is the need for the day. And so while we talked about how the onus is also on women to voice out some of these patterns, that to talk
Yeah.
about how certain public spaces or certain programs slash products don't work for them. Like, for example, right, like if someone doesn't have train schedules, they're going to, like, one odd person builds an app or something that other people who have the same problem can then use. You can't expect the state to build a state something that's going to solve that problem, right? I mean, you can, but that's not going to happen because
Yeah.
there's a bunch of such things that fall off, right? And so the onus is on interested parties to voice out issues, make this data known, and possibly, with, if resources existing, wherever existing, work on these sort of gaps and see how you can
Yeah.
make move that needle forward in that sense. But speaking more broadly, right, what are lessons for the state or for markets in this case, right? So India has committed to sex disaggregated data under various national programs and policies. And so this mandate exists, but you will need to do it for a long enough period of time to see consistent, data on that front. Also, when public infrastructure is being designed on an ongoing basis, we redesign them and then we sort of break that and design it again. So this is an ongoing project, and women need to be involved directly in the urban planning stage. This might be like a novel idea in that we won't know how to go about it, but there has to be a way to sort of start doing this. And I'm pretty sure we'll flounder quite a bit before we sort of see some sort of structure or system emerging in why this makes sense to do. I'm not going to say that it's going to be super evident to people why we should be doing it from the get-go. Even if all this data and these books are available, right, you will still need to sort of wade in this sort of uncertain process before it starts making sense. So it also calls for like a mindset shift in working with processes in a way that are sort of iterative, are more experiential, more thoughtful. So this is going to be something that's a little bit different from how these sort of programs are run. It's very sort of programmatic and very timeline based. But before all of that, I think there needs to be some amount of reflective designing that needs to be done, taking in partnership with women who are also, you know, who can also be spokespersons for other women. Also, like an example you mentioned earlier, right, there needs to be a shift from equal to equitable. Equal is not always equal, and same and is not always equal, is not always the same as fair. And in many cases, equitable is an entirely different solution. It doesn't look equal in most cases. So that's a conversation that needs to be had, and it's very specific to every sort of problem or parameter we're talking about. There is no sort of one rule in that front. Also, like we spoke about, right, there needs to be more market solutioning in like care infrastructures and care systems. India is still a country with a very lower female labor force participation in comparison to other Asian countries even, right? And so if that's something we're parallelly working on, but if that's something we want to work on more, this will also really help in that market solutions not only bring more private data, um, that at least create some sort of precedent for like success failure of an idea, but it also really helps in women having more options to either consider work, not consider work, and decide accordingly. And also safety, right? The book has made it abundantly clear that the idea of safety for men versus women is so completely different, just by also taking into account what you said from India, right?
Right.
And safety has to be an integral part of design, and this is true across the board for like public spaces, parks, roads, everything, right? Any sort of public infrastructure needs to put safety front and center. That would go a long way, I think, in sort of making it easier for women. Yeah. And lastly, also some ways to nudge funding for women's health and innovation. This is still a largely underfunded segment of, even as a consumer group. And so that's something that I also took away from this book, in that this is a untapped market at large.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a bunch of things to be done. I think, we're obviously better off than we were a couple of decades ago, and it's only going to improve from now. But it's important to focus on what more we can do to, shorten the timeline and see more equitable access to resources, and also look at the intersection of gender with other issues such as how different caste groups function or how different religions function, and sort of see how that also differently affects different groups of women. Also take that into account when we're thinking about policies, and infrastructure, and even technologies developed for different use cases. So yeah, I think overall, it's quite a insightful book even for us who go through a lot of these things on a regular basis, but it helps to see all of this from a more broader lens and see how there are second and third order impacts of this very basic sort of lack of data that's available. And yeah, I think book lays it out pretty well. There's a lot to be learned and a lot to be implemented as well in the way that we think about policies.
Yeah, I agree. The book is super exhaustive. In fact, it's so exhaustive that it's a little bit depressing in that there's so many examples
Yeah,
across
yeah.
cultures. But I also want to underscore the fact that for a really long time, or in like popular discourse, these are very emotionally charged
Yeah.
conversations, and so it's often very polarized. One group, which is women, feel like this is obviously unfair, right? I mean,
Yeah.
but then that also makes it a hot potato for other practitioners to sort of who want to just get their job done to, and with tight timelines or whatever, to not sort of touch that gamut whatsoever. But I think like in the long run, it would really help for us to look at this as a problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah.
Like you said, it has gotten better over the decades and it will continue to get better, but it's still a problem that we need to solve. And that sort of a mindset sounds a little dispassionate, but it's also not, in that you are sort of working towards making it better for women throughout. And I think that's what I would also take away for myself, in that I want to be more dispassionate about it and think of it from like a problem solving mindset, as opposed to, which is also true, the other part is also true, in that this is, I mean, how are we in this position, right? Like, I mean, this shouldn't be the case, but invariably so this is the case. There is a huge gender gap. Our products are not designed for multiple genders, they're designed for one default. And so until that changes, things are going to be suboptimal for multiple gender groups, right, that are not male. So yeah, here's hoping.
Yeah, exactly.
So with that somber but hopeful thought, we will close. Thank you,
Yes.
Anwesha, for this conversation.
Thank
I
you
truly
so
enjoyed
much.
it.
Yeah, likewise. Thank
For
you.
folks who want to read more, please check out Caroline's book called Invisible Women. And I'm sure there's more books from an India standpoint as well. So please look them up. And please write to us at contact@takshashila.org.in if you have thoughts or comments on this topic. And we'll see you next time.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.